He said today 85% of children living in care in China are now living in families. And I said, what does 85% mean? I said, is it 1 million? And he smiled and he said, no, it's not 1 million. It's much more than 1 million. And I thought, wow, it took 17 years, but God's faithful.
Hello everybody, my name's Simon Gilbo and we're back with Inspired. This week we've got Robert Glover, OBE. He's awarded an OBE in 2005 by the Queen for his work in China. It's absolutely fantastic. Robert, I was given this book a few months ago, As Many as the Stars, A Story of Change for the Children of China. And I was so deeply stirred and inspired myself. I read in the book the connections with my uncle, Ross Patterson, who's one of my heroes, and I'll be doing a podcast with him in the next few weeks. But I don't want to tell your own story, so let's just get straight into it, Robert. Welcome. Thanks for coming on. And how about just kicking us off with a bit of background before the China episode? Where were you born, brought up, raised, that sort of stuff?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Good to be here. I didn't realise you were related to Ross, who is a foundational pinnacle in our story of China. So
great.
My background was very much Norfolk. I was a Norfolk boy. My wife is from Norfolk, and as in the early episode of the book, it describes you can't get anything more different from the sort of market towns and the beaches of Norfolk to places like Shanghai and Beijing. What a contrast!
Yeah.
So, that was my background. As a young boy, like many young boys, I was passionate about football. I wanted to be a football player. Of course, that didn't work out. I then thought, well, I'll go and see the world, and joined the Royal Navy. And I ended up in a submarine in the Baltic. So that didn't work out. But, God always has his plan. And I always say there's no better place to be than where God wants you to be. And because it took a bit of time for me to, being married and 6 children, and then God started to reveal his plan for our life, which was really exciting.
At what stage did your faith journey actively start?
Oh, very early, Simon, interestingly. I mean, my father left when I was 2, so my home growing up was mum, granny, and 2 sisters, very much a female world. But I used to take myself off to church, and probably 12, 13, quite very passionate about Jesus. And in some sense, you get the Father's love. You get that, for young men growing up that don't have a father, God the Father it is the stability that brings you through. Mm-hmm. And church life, we were in quite a charismatic Anglican church, even then in the 60s and 70s, where the church was full of families and people. And so, I remember, very young age being introduced to Jesus and having that walk. I guess like many, my adolescence and young manhood, there's a little bit there where God can wait while I go and explore the world. And then I think what happened is I had quite a drastic illness, Guillain-Barré syndrome, where I found myself married with a young daughter and paralyzed from the waist down. So that was my sort of brick wall. And then I had quite a divine healing in that respect. So I thought that that really brought me back to tune into God and, well, what do you have for me then?
What was the story on the healing?
Well, it was quite remarkable. I remember I got to the stage where I was in quite a bad state, and my wife and my mother were quite concerned about me. And the next day I went down to have an X-ray, and they took me down to Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, the big corridor, the old hospital. There was a big corridor, and I lay on the bed waiting to go in for the X-ray. And if you can imagine those flappy doors that they pushed beds through. Mm-hmm. These doors suddenly opened and a wind came through, and I breathed in. And of course, I'd been up in a stuffy old ward up, and this was wonderful, breathing this air, this fresh air. I was in the intensive care, and this was the first time I'd got air for a few months. And I noticed there's one of these massive clocks on the wall as well, and it was 11 o'clock. I thought, wow, that's great. And from there, I felt really good. And that evening, my mother and Elizabeth, my wife, came. And they said, "You look so much better today." I said, "I feel so much better." I went down for an X-ray. This wind came through the door, and I just filled my lungs with it, and I just made me feel so good. They said, "What time was that?" I said, "Well, I can tell you because there was a big old clock there, and it was 11 o'clock." And they smiled at each other because at 11 o'clock they gathered people because they were so concerned to pray for my healing. So
I love those stories. Fantastic. Yeah. So you recovered. Your wife. I mean, you got 6 children now, but that was with one. Was that when you went into social work?
I think after the Navy, when I came back to Norfolk, I went into social work. I went initially into residential social work, and then went on to University of St. Anglia and took the completed the degree, and then became fostering officer for Central Norfolk. So that was very much in those early days, and I think there it was where God started to speak to me about these children that were growing up in children's homes, institutions, and that He created the family for children, and children just do so much better when they have mothers and fathers, which I realised as we placed children into substitute families, they started to thrive and take off. And so it wasn't, it wasn't rocket science. It was a very simple thing of, God created the family for children.
So were you able to enact policies back then already to change how people view things in the system?
And absolutely, in Norfolk, that's what I did. I went through a whole social welfare reform from, I think we went for something like 4,000 children in residential care down to about 40 by developing family placement. And it was very effective.
And was that recognised by government? Has that become policy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was recognised by people we worked for. I then went to work for Guernsey and did a very similar thing there. I think it was starting to be recognised across the board, in social welfare in the UK. But of course, what I hadn't realised was there was a massive world out there that included Asia where, literally thousands of, we know 8 million children living in institutions.
Yeah. So you're on Guernsey. When was it at that stage that you received this remarkable prophecy from, well, there are various words, weren't there? David Devenish, what he said. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, well, I think by this time, obviously I think a lot of my faith has been very practical. Guernsey we were in a very good church in Guernsey and a very good theologian teacher. And so it was fantastic foundation stuff. Little did we know it was foundation for the journey we were about to go on. I mean, I think that time was quite precious because it was where we were building our family and everybody was content. And I remember coming along and someone saying, I didn't know too much about the prophetic then, that this man was coming over to speak on the Sunday, he had a prophetic ministry. So, I guess I was a bit cautious and sat at the back. Mm-hmm. And he made his way through and gave me this word that he just felt that I was going to be father to as many children as there are stars in the sky. And it's a sort of Abrahamic prophetic word, and which I didn't understand at all. It didn't mean anything to me at that time.
Yeah, so that's what is it? That's Genesis 15, isn't it? That God took Abram out of his tent and said, look at the stars and sky, as many as the stars and sky, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed God and it's credited to him as righteousness. Yes. Mm. So, and so that didn't make much sense to you at that stage?
None at all, really. No. I thought, well, I've got 6 children. I'm doing, I help out with the Sunday school. I do a bit of youth work. So
you're doing your bit.
We're talking about massive numbers here. Mm.
So what were the next steps? Or you just put that on the back burner and carried on living your way?
Well, it was on the back burner. And then I think 96, I was at Stoney Bible Week. And again, I was doing youth work. A lot of energy, a lot of fun. And I think at the end of one session, the Australian guy asked if he could pray with me. It's fine. And he came up, as he was praying, he just said, I just sense within this year going to be an earthquake, and it's where God wants you to be. And again, I thought, he obviously doesn't realise we don't have earthquakes in this country. So, yeah, you tend to sort of park it a bit. But, yeah, as the year went on, I had the opportunity to go out to China in November, and I went with a friend. And people prayed for us, and a little girl had a picture that we'd taken an Olympic torch to China, which again, I was starting to pick up on these things and listen to them. You hear people preaching about the Holy Spirit and about being tuned in, having the radio antenna and everything. And so off we went to China, which was my, since I was a child, I was fascinated about China. I mean, most people were looking at America and Hollywood and all the music coming out of America. I was just had this incredible fascination for the Chinese and the Chinese culture. And so, we land, I think, in Hong Kong, and she spent some time with Jackie Pullinger. Just amazing time, in the Hung Fu camp with all the drug addicts that she was working with. And I got to say, I really enjoyed just talking to these guys and, sitting outside drinking Chinese tea and hearing their lives and stuff, which was fascinating. And of course, then we go into Shanghai, and this lady gives us tickets to the Special Olympic Games. And of course, that little girl's picture of an Olympic torch, I connected, and we went to the stadium and ended up sitting next to this very influential key guy, and it was by we didn't know, there was nothing prearranged, but he then invites us to a meeting, a dinner, and I didn't know at that time. Of course, now I've lived in China for many years, and everything in China is done through what we call guanxi, which is relationships. It's you don't even talk about business or anything you're doing until you had a good meal and socialize and talk, and So I ended up at this luncheon where there were some Chinese officials, Shanghai officials, and some international NGOs that were wagging their fingers and telling them off and telling them they were all doing it all wrong. I was just enjoying the food. It was and I think I was a bit of a contrast to these other people, because I was just saying, food is amazing. It's just lovely. Really enjoying it. And I didn't know you could make beer, and this Qingdao beer is really quite good, And of course, this is all part of China. Face is important. Yeah. You don't embarrass people, and relationships important, and guanxi. And so all this was going on naturally. God had obviously put that into me, and of course, they got rid of the other guys and brought me back for another meal in the evening, which was, again, wonderful. And they started to talk, and they started to say, well, how do you do this? And how do you do that? And we ended up, at the end of the meal, the sort of senior guy saying, will you come back and help us? And I didn't really know what that meant, but, I was more than happy, very pleased that I might be able to come back with my wife in a couple of weeks and, try and help them start family placement, because that's what they want to do.
I love it, because you talk about getting that trip. I don't think people realise. You just went there with a blank slate. It was a recce, wasn't it? You didn't have a clue what was going to happen, and then that guy was just about the most influential person in Shanghai in the field that you needed, wasn't he?
Absolutely, yeah. So the interesting thing is, we went back to the hotel that night, and there was a wedding going on, and we got embroiled in this wedding. We ended up giving toasts and blessings, and we were part. It was incredible. We ended up back at our room quite exhausted when suddenly, our beds start to move and the curtains are moving, and we're sort of scratching our heads, looking out the window. Everybody's running around. And we better go and find someone, find out what's going on. And we went out onto the landing of the hotel, and all the doors were open, everybody else had gone. And as I stood in that door frame, I heard that Australian man's voice come back. within this year you'll be in an earthquake. It's where God wants you. So useful for
Goosebumps.
Shanghai, 6.4 on the Richter scale out in the Japanese Sea, but it had rocked Shanghai and rocked me into realizing where God wanted me to be.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. So you go back to England, you talk to your wife, Liz, about it, but surely it's a ridiculous thought to ship 6 children and your whole family across to China.
Well, I think it always was. However, I think we were in a place, probably where many Christians get. We were so fervent. We were in that prayer life of probably 18 months of saying, God, use us. We want to be used. We don't want to sit back. We want to give everything. So it wasn't that surprising when it came up. I got a phone call within days of being back in Guernsey, and it was the Foreign Office, and so I had to fly to London and talk to the Foreign Office, and they'd been contacted, and basically they were saying, look, if you go, we'll get behind and support it.
Mm-hmm.
We were a bit hush-hush at the beginning because even then the relationships between UK and China were a little bit fraught, but it was an olive branch really to try and build UK-China relationships. And I think Elizabeth was very much for it, and the children. I mean, it was a sacrifice. It was much to give up, but it was a sense that we had a call, we had a opportunity to serve God. And I think Elizabeth's journey is a bit different because she went to China and she really felt that she couldn't take her children there, and then she saw the children in the orphanage. And she saw their plight, and she realized that we needed to go for those children. And I think there was quite an amazing testimony she has. She wakes up one night, and I think someone put us in the Hilton Hotel, which was a lovely hotel. She wakes up in the middle of the night, and she's crying, thinking, I can't do this. And she feels God say, well, you don't need to do that. And then she picks up the Bible and she reads, from the Canaan wedding, where Jesus takes 6 clay pots and fills them with the best wine. And she realizes, if we're going to do this, Jesus will fill my children with the best wine. So it was, very, very touching. And I think then things happened very quickly. And before we knew it, we were on our way to Shanghai. And the funny thing always was, we speak to the Chinese officials. I was their senior consultant for social welfare. They had a 1-child policy, and I had 6 children.
Yeah, so ironic. And I've traveled around the world with my kids. I've shifted them across continents. Only 3, not your 6. I know from reading the book, it was challenging, weren't they? Staying in different places and not having a home base, and for quite a while.
Yeah.
How was it fraught for your marriage? How was that?
Yeah, I think it made us a very strong unit as a family, because living in China, we didn't speak the language. We didn't understand the culture. We didn't know what we were going to be eating that day. We didn't know if the kids would get to school. So our prayer life became really strong. We had to pray in every situation. And it wasn't a case of being just religious. It was the fact we really relied on our prayer, that the kids would get home from school, that the food we ate wouldn't make us ill, that one of the kids going back for a medical reason would, be able to get on the flight and get back. So there was all things like that. The prayer life became really centric, and we became a really strong unit as a family. We still are together. I've got 6 children, 5 of which are married, and we've got 6 grandchildren. So it was a very tight family. And if nothing else, as a father coming out of this, you disciple your children. The one thing you want for them is that they're going to be serving God and saved and, radical Christians, all of which I can say as a father, I have the privilege of seeing my kids, fly. The trouble is, it says in the book, sometimes they do things and I'm trying to modify it, and they're going, but you didn't do that, Dad.
Yeah. So, it's wonderful. It's a on the ground discipleship, isn't it? Living out, seeing God's provision. We
Absolutely.
in Burundi, I mean, we had one particular episode where, there was gunfire and burning barricades, and the temptation was to leave, but we're saying no, we're not leaving, and this is our country, and we're staying, and God, incarnation is engagement. It's choosing to stay, and well, I mean, it's a different podcast to tell all those stories, but God's protection on us, God's provision, and then our kids develop their own stories, and they see God's faithfulness themselves rather than playing it safe and trying to keep out of trouble. So it's beautiful to hear that all your kids have got their own stories. In the book, you talk about Joe. Can you tell us his story?
So Joe lived in one of the poorest provinces of China in Gansu. Through his parents' breakup, he ended up with his father. His father remarried, and then one day took him to the train station, said, "We don't want you anymore." I think he was possibly 10.
Mm-hmm.
And he went back to the house and they wouldn't let him in. And so he got on a train and he became one of the street children of China. He got in with a gang that went down, they were hopping on trains and ended up in Shanghai. He eventually ends up back in Beijing where Liz saw him, and he was outside McDonald's. And what he would do is sweep the floor and clean all the tables. And she watched as they gave him some fries and a burger, and he wrapped the burger up, put it in his pocket, and eat the fries. So she knew he was in a desperate state. She asked if he wanted to come home and have a bath and have some warm clothes and warm food, which he did, and he became part of our family. And remarkably, our kids, really received him well. And Joe never told us his story. He wouldn't tell because he was frightened that we would push him out. But we knew he wasn't. He said he was 10. We knew he was older than that. And eventually he let slip the school that he went to in his hometown. So one of my staff rang up and spoke to the headmaster, who knew him, knew he was very intelligent, which we knew he was incredibly intelligent, and told us the story about the mother and the father, connected us with the mother. So we then spoke to the mother about us going down, taking Joe home, and that was going to happen. But it was Chinese New Year, and we couldn't get the train. So we invited her up. Meantime, Christmas morning, we all got a present for him. And when he came up, everybody in the family gave him presents that meant things to him. So he loved to swim, but couldn't swim. So I bought him some armbands so he could. And he broke down. He gave his life to Jesus on that Christmas morning.
Beautiful.
And was, such a privilege. And then Mum comes up on Chinese New Year. There's this a bit tension between, and then brought together with hugs and cries and tears and love. And then just a privilege to watch Joe lead his mother to the Lord. And then, they went home back together, and we funded his schooling till he finished, which was not very much, and her few of her bills that needed. But we felt that was the right place for Joe, even though he'd been part of our family for 6 months. Joe needed to be back with his mum, and that's where it was right to be.
I love it. I love it that that's whole family ministering together, and you've got, the big picture, the whole of China, millions, but also the one, and God sees the one, and he sees every single one. And that is at the heart of the gospel, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of the journey of care for children, I mean, there's lots to say. So I'll just give you go for it. Tell us the sort of snapshots of the key developments in each part.
Yeah, well, I think initially we did a pilot project, and the pilot went from 3 to 5 years. We saw in Shanghai 500 children moved from the state orphanage into families, and we started to see, these transformed lives. Now, back then, Simon, most people were still supporting orphanages, including, the church and Christians. And what I was doing was against the pendulum. I was working against the tide in the sense of, saying children need families, they need to grow up in families. So at that time, it was a message that was not always received well, because, if you've invested in an orphanage, you want to see the best for it. So
Mm.
I fully understood that. But for countries and governments, they needed to understand there was a positive alternative of family placement. And so over the next sort of 15, 20 years, we started to see the pendulum swing. But within China, the 500 then moved to, from Shanghai to three cities in the west. We started work in Kunming in Yunnan province, up in Chengdu, in Sichuan province, and then up in Yinchuan. So we started to get different models, and we started to see children transformation right across the country. There was a little girl that kind of broke the back in China, where she had been born with a hole in the heart, and she was a tiny little skin and bone, and they thought she was going to die. Placed her actually into a Christian family who did remarkably with her. I remember going back and seeing this chubby-cheeked little toddler
Beautiful.
with a ballerina suit on, and she was doing all her moves for me in the hospital. And then they said, "Look, she's so fit and strong. Let's do the tests." And so, I think the doctor came and did the test. He came out. I remember him lifting his glasses and wiping a tear, and he said, I honestly don't understand it, but there's nothing wrong with her heart. And it made national news. This is communist China in the 90s, went in national. And I still remember it was a miracle baby healed by the love of a mother. And it just changed the whole country. Everybody then wanted to develop family placement. And so we got invited to move from Shanghai to Beijing to roll out a national program. And that was huge for our family because, there's something about when you go to that first city, Shanghai, that you lock in, you build friends, Christian community, and having to detach from that was harder than perhaps leaving England. So we went up to Beijing and we rolled out initially 15 provinces and then 30 provinces. We started to hear the numbers were going up, to the thousands, the tens of thousands. And we'd always had as an organization, my American friends always tell me, you've got to have a good vision, big vision, vision for 1 million, which I'm not sure that we actually believed. In fact, some of our trustees used to say, "Robert, this is against the Trade Description Act," or something, And I used to say, well, look, I might not see it in my lifetime, but I believe God for it. I believe God will honor that vision one day. And in 2014, they changed the legislation, which was a big, big move. That actually in China, their preference was to place children into families rather than institution. I think I was at an HDB Focus conference, and the Chinese Central Television came and found me and interviewed me in Hyde Park. And I remember just weeping because that was that was a massive milestone to see that the government had changed the law. And then in 2018, this idea came up. We would go back to China, Elizabeth and I, and find some of the children and make this documentary called Children of Shanghai. So we found 5 of the children that we'd placed 20 years previous. And we went back, and the stories were just incredible. One of the 5 was a lad that was abandoned at the age of 9, went into the family, and he just goes on to, works as a coder. He works in one of the biggest companies in the world called Tencent. Just incredible. And then there was this little girl. I was very anxious to go and see her because she had cerebral palsy, and they were really worried about placing her in a family. They didn't think that she would manage. And I mean, see the film. It is fantastic. She had gone on to win a gold medal at the Sydney Special Olympic Games, which he presented to me in the film, the medal, which is absolutely incredible. So him and these 5, children that just phenomenally transformed lives. And then we had this national conference where people came from all over. So it was just great seeing everybody from all the provinces coming in This was in Shanghai. And one of the presenters was a man from the Beijing Bureau of Statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And he came up within his speech, said that today 85% of children living in care in China are now living in families. And that pricked my ears. I went to see him afterwards and I said, what does 85% mean? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, is it 1 million? He said, I've got no idea. So I said, how do we find? He said, well, give me 24 hours and I'll do some research and come back. So I caught him the next day and I went up and said, is it 1 million? and he smiled and he said, no, it's not 1 million. It's much more than 1 million. And I thought, wow, it took 17 years, but God's faithful.
Amen.
Seeing that vision come to fruit.
Incredible. You mentioned Children of Shanghai, that documentary narrated by Bear Grylls. So how can people see that?
Yeah, so it's on Sky Documentary. It's also on, you can go on to Vimeo, or you can go on to www.childrenofshanghai.com, and then you can click on the Vimeo and see it there.
Right.
Yeah, narrated by Bear Grylls. And that's more of, I think the book, As Many as the Stars, more the spiritual story. The documentary, because it went out on to secular TV, is more the outcomes of what happens when you put children in the family. The interesting thing is the prophecy comes in right at the end, and it has Matt Redman's song, the Father's song.
Mm-hmm.
And someone in the Sun newspaper, I think the editor or one of the feature editors, had seen it, couldn't stop crying. And he made contact and asked if they could do an article. So we wouldn't normally sort of go to the Sun, but he ended up with a 2-page spread in the Sun.
Fantastic. Coming back to the documentary, has it fulfilled your expectations?
Well, that's very interesting, Simon, because one of the things I'd expected, it went out on 1st of June, which was Children's Day, and I was thinking, wow, this will reach a lot of people, and it did. It reached millions, and I thought, well, that'll be a great financial resource for the charity. Well, God often has different ideas and plans, and in this time, which is really interesting, this time of there's a lot of bad news out there, and in this time of a lot of bad news around China and Hong Kong specifically, what the documentary brought is almost a tsunami of people saying, I didn't understand the Chinese people were like this. Such humility, such resilience. You know, they take care of their children. They've looked after these children. They're incredible. So I think the media paints quite a one-sided picture of China. And, you know, we all know different countries have different expressions for seasons of, you know, their administration. We don't all paint Americans on who President Trump was. But yet, because of the administration with China at the moment, it's seen like all of China like that. So I often ask people when they say, oh, China's doing this, what do you mean by China? Because I've lived amongst these people. They're the most humble, graceful, loving people you can ever meet, practical. There's lots of qualities. Of course, there's lots of failings, as we have in all the world. But, you know, they have had a very bad take from the media. And I think what the documentary not only shows the outcomes of the children, but it shows the real sense, the passion, the heartbeat of the Chinese people. And I think that's something that maybe God's done, because I was talking to a PR agency last week, and they were saying that there's so much bad news out there now that people are switching televisions off, they're not reading newspapers. All the media numbers are dropping drastically. And the media have suddenly realized that they're appointing good news editors. This is apparently a new thing that's happening. And they're actually asking Christian agencies, because they know Christians can bring good news.
That's right.
it's an interesting season
Mm,
where so much bad news that people really are fed up with in switching TV off and not buying newspapers, that they're having to rethink about how they position themselves in the media.
absolutely. Well, I mean, that's why we're doing this podcast. It's just because it's so fed up of depressing podcasts and depressing stories. So it's all about inspiring people to have faith. And you're certainly doing that for us, Robert, here. It's fantastic. Hi, folks. I hope you're enjoying the podcast as much as I am. If you are, can you spread the word? Can you gossip it to your friends? And if you want to help us in terms of covering the cost of the podcast, all monies ultimately go out to our work in Burundi, which is, amongst other things, the hungriest country in the world. So we'd love your support for that. Then please go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. Now let's get back to the podcast. There's one part in the book where you talk about, because I think most people listening will be aware of the fact that China is actually shutting down or making it much harder on Christians outside the official state church, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, that you went with an official who was maybe condescending or slightly negative about your faith, but mentioned your faith. And then it turned out that virtually all those families that were taking in kids were Christian. Is that right?
Yep. So I went on a train journey overnight from Beijing up into Inner Mongolia. And, as we were journeying out of Beijing, Mr. Lee sort of says to me, there are no Christians up in Baotao. And I said, well, that's fine. And he was very concerned. He kept talking about this. And while we were playing cards and drinking tea, and he said, look, they're Buddhists and they're Taoists and Confucian, and there's Muslim, but there are no Christians. I said, that's fine, don't worry. I know I'm very concerned. And anyway, we get to Baotao, and the army have come to meet us because I had a particular relationship with one of the ministers, Vice Minister Yiming Fu, who actually got behind our work, was a great support to our work. And so they took us to the Great People's Hall of Baotao, where the mayor was, and we had traditional sort of relationship meal. And they said they were going to bring the first 20 families in. So, they had applied to take the children, been approved. And my friend Mr. Lee then tells this joke about me being a Christian, a big Englishman was a Christian. And I didn't get it, and I don't think anybody else got it. So he told the story again, He was laughing, but no one else was. And then one of the ladies, one of the couples, the wife, put her hand up and she said, I'm a Christian. And then the next person, and the next person, all 20 of the families were Christian. And of course, you can imagine on the journey home, Mr. Lee was very embarrassed. And he said, well, why is it these Christians are doing this? And so I just felt I could tell him then, this is part of our DNA. This is who we are. We take widows and orphans. It's part of our gospel message. And so I was able to show him in my Bible. And he said, when I get back to Beijing, I'm going to do some research in 3 of the provinces to see how many Christians are doing this. And of course, a few weeks later, he rings me up and he says it's 86% are Christian.
Wow.
Which was very revealing to him, because it wasn't that I'd recruited them.
Yeah.
It was the fact that, for me, it wasn't surprising. We were going through the biggest revival of Christianity in world history.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't surprising that the Christians were coming forward to do this work. But for him, it had meant a big thing. And the interesting thing now is with the book, which is, I would say quite, got a lot of Christian content. The Chinese government want to publish it. And I said to them, well, what about the Christian content? Well, we know you're a Christian. This is very Chinese, by the way. They're very pragmatic. It's like, well, we can park that, still tells a good story.
Yes. I mean, what I sort of struggle to, and it's more than frustration because so many lives and genuine suffering is at stake, is that there, is being embodied the gospel, and it's very helpful and productive, fruitful, positive, impacting for Chinese society, and yet Christianity is still seen as a threat by the authorities, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more to do with anything that's counter-revolutionary or gaining more ground than, So it's all about, in China, we have to understand that for many years the West has kept China down by divide and rule through politics and imperialism and all sorts of horrendous things we've done. So in a sense, there's this. The way they see it is this strength through their unity and this heart, as Hu Jintao said, this harmonious society. So it's managing people. China's bit has always been about managing people. So I think it's very easy to have a democracy in a population of 50 million, 60 million. But when you're talking about a population of 1.4 million over the expanse of the geographical China, then that becomes much harder to maintain and control, because if it gets out of control, we've seen that in China's history where the students rebel, you end up with something like Tiananmen Square, which is obviously a big deal. So I think for China, it always is about managing numbers and managing that harmonious society. And anything, it's not that China is anti-Christian, it's anything that comes and challenges the harmonious society that they would want to suppress.
So would you say having said that you've experienced one of the greatest revivals in the history, so numerically it's been staggering, hasn't it? Would you say you're hopeful for the future of the church in China?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, I'm quite well connected with the Urban Host Church, and their message always has been, during persecution, numbers increased incredibly. Their problem was, during the time where there wasn't persecution, there had been materialism. They would see their biggest threat to their churches and their Christian development as being materialism. Materialism has robbed their numbers of people. So in some ways, and this is hard for us to understand in the West, they're actually more happy in the situation they're in now because the numbers are growing.
Yes, I remember preaching at a conference with a friend, and he'd done a lot of work out there. And I mean, this is a number of years ago, but he was very impressed by this young man, very vibrant Christian, and then one of the older guys came up to him and sidled alongside him and said, "Yeah, he's very." Very full of potential, but we don't really trust him yet. All the rest of us, we've been to prison for our faith, and that was our Bible school, that was our education, that was our discipleship, and he hasn't yet really suffered. So do you think that there's going to be more of that coming? Or, I mean, it strikes me from the outside that it's getting harder.
Yeah, it's a different world today. However, the Chinese are very good at managing. So, they've gone back to house church. That works. And they've seen that work in the past, and it will work now. I think, for China, that grows with them, and that will develop with them, the Christian faith. And it's not, when we talk about, a lot of people talk about persecution Christian, it was very much of the rural farmers, uneducated revival that happened, that I guess that the authorities thought was a little bit of hype and ignorance and stuff. Now what we're seeing is educated, affluent, well-positioned people coming to faith. So I think it's a different expression today than it was of the one that we all associate to China.
All right. So, Robert, as we come towards an end now, what do things look like for you now?
Yeah, well, the thing is, this goes on, because China's been a success in the region. Every government want us to come and help them transform
Fantastic.
their social welfare. So we've been working with Thailand, we've been working with Vietnam, we're about to work with Cambodia. And so there's a call to action there because to be able to do this, we need resources. And Indonesia waiting, Nepal. The good thing about it is we've now digitalized. During COVID, we've been able to digitalize all our training materials and all our methodology. It's all been digitalized, put on, so we'll be able to move much quicker. We're about to launch Cambodia this year, which is a huge, huge issue. Cambodia's been in quite a mess, and this will make such a difference if we can get a formalized government family placement system in place, because there's so many children falling through the net, Cambodia.
Yeah.
But it takes resources. So we need partners. We need, people to come alongside and work with us to make this happen. And, that's where we're at the moment. I think sometimes you're a product of your success. Now we're having to, build resources to go into some of these other nations and see the same thing happen.
Wonderful. So the show goes on, it gets bigger and bigger, more and more, over and above the million. As many as the stars, so shall your offspring be. That was a promise to Abram, who became Abraham. Abram means exalted father. Abraham, the father of many nations. I've preached on those passages a number of times, but Robert Glover, sort of modern day Abraham in that way. And I love it's the sovereignty of God, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to sort of be rude, but in a sense, you were just this random social worker on Guernsey. And yet, being here I am, send me, Isaiah style, you're up for it. You got a wonderful woman who's up for it, and you just go and God weaves the tapestry of your life, and you sit down next to this guy at the Special Olympics, and the rest is history. It's just that could be any of us, couldn't it? If we're up for it.
Absolutely. We often tell people that remind people that we're a very ordinary family. The only thing we had is obedience and faith to go.
Yes.
And when God gets people like that, they take them on a roller coaster. So if you've got faith and you're obedient, God will take you on an incredible journey.
Amen. Well, do you know, I've got goosebumps. And obedience and faith, people, that's what it's about. Well, this has been Inspired with Robert Glover. Listen, I'm going to do a blog on this with all the various links for As Many as the Stars. I'd love you guys to buy that book through St. Andrew's Bookshop if you're in the UK, because we want to keep those guys more than just in business. They've got a fantastic ministry. There'll be information on care for children and also the documentary Children of Shanghai. So, it's been a real pleasure, Robert. God bless you and your family and your ministry and the great nation of China and the million plus increasing beyond China into Cambodia and Thailand and Nepal, wherever the Lord takes you. I just pray his continued favor. I know he'll go with you. You know that as well. We wish you all the very best. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sam.
So, folks, that's it this week. We'll be back next week with another fantastic guest. Until then, toodaloo.